I thought the script was well written. I thought it was quite exciting, you know, and I thought the part was good. And I wanted to go to Australia. It was different to go there to make a horror film, I suppose, and also because we were making so many horror films in England around that time. You know, Hammer Horror, and I did a film for a guy called Peter Walker, and another one called The Uncanny. But you see, I think there was a bit of kudos actually to work in Australia and in the Australian film industry because of those, and The Wave. There was a film called The Wave, The Last Wave, and they were all a bit arty and good. So to go over to Australia to make a movie was, I think, a bit prestigious. Richard wanted to sell it overseas and didn't want it to sound particularly Australian, because so many of the cast didn't sound Australian. It was a film that Richard Franklin wanted to be international, and he didn't want it to be parochial in any way. But the first thing I knew about Richard was what a Hitchcock fan he was, really, and I had nothing but respect for him because he was a very good director. There was a scene, for instance, when I think I came out of a shower with a towel above my head, and just the way the camera moved with me to the door, the tension, the way he built up tension, it was like Psycho, you know. And also the house. I mean, Roger's clinic was very much like the house in Psycho. Yeah, I remember him talking a lot about it as well. One of the things I remember about Richard was his sense of humour, and that's a really good thing to have around on a set. In terms of the way we film, like the crew and the whole setup was very professional. I didn't really notice any difference except this slight feeling of, here I was, a pommy actress coming over and taking someone's job. I think it was a very different time in Australia in the 70s, and Melbourne was very different then. I mean, they put me in the Windsor Hotel, you know, which used to have tea dances in the afternoon. And I was young, and I felt a bit lonely, actually, to tell you the truth. I also had to kind of prove myself, that I could do the job, I think. But I had been making some quite low-budget films in England anyway, one in particular, a film called Private Road, which was just so low budget. It was just like a group of us going around with a camera, and it was all improvised. So I didn't feel that over there. I didn't feel it was kind of frontier land in any way. And maybe it's just me, but I felt I had to prove myself. And there was a very much a feeling of, you know, we are doing, this is ours, this is Australian. And particularly it was one of the first horror films to be made there. You know, and the truth is, you could have had an Australian actress. So I had to act with a character who didn't say a word, you know, didn't have any reaction whatsoever except spit a few times. And the challenge was to try and really not make it funny, I think, was to try and make it truthful. Robert Thompson, of course, sometimes had to do quite long takes without blinking. And Richard would become fixated with this, and so, you know, after a very long take where Robert was trying really hard not to blink, he'd say, you blinked there, sorry, we've all got to go again because he blinked. And he'd do this a lot, really for his own amusement sometimes, actually. Sir Robert Helpman was absolutely wonderful. I mean, he was one of those characters that I wish I'd written down, you know, what he talked about, because he had worked with everyone, you know. I mean, one evening it would be a story, going back in the taxi, because we both lived in the Windsor Hotel. He had a kind of suite above me, and he wasn't interested in me. I don't know why. Why wasn't he interested in me? And He tells stories about Vivian Leigh and Laurence Olivier and Coward, and I mean it was just mind-boggling to a young British actress, really. But he knew what he wanted to do in the film. You know, I think there were quite a few discussions with Richard about script. I think he was a little bit over the top sometimes. That's what I feel. I think Richard tried to get him to take it down a bit. I remember that now. Richard kept saying, I think you should just bring it down, you know, do less. But Robert Helpman wasn't having any of it, you know. My last memory of Sir Robert Helpman was the day, really, he broke his back. Because as everyone knows, you know, he was very camp. And Robert, who played Patrick, was rather a good-looking young boy. And I think Robert Helpman really couldn't wait to get his hands on him, actually. And there was a scene where Patrick fell out of bed. And Robert Helpman wasn't young at this time, you know. And Richard Franklin said, now, I think perhaps the two of you should get Patrick back into bed. And Robert Helpman said, no, I can lift him. You know, I was a dancer. I know how to do lifts. I'll do a fireman's lift. Anyway, this happened, and he threw Robert over his shoulders and did a kind of comedy stagger, is the only thing I can describe it as. And, of course, had broken his back. I mean, this was really pretty awful. And the last image I have of him, the last time I saw him, was they managed to carry him and put him into a taxi, and it was his face was all squashed against the window like that, and he was waving, going. I remember that Rod Mullinar, who was sort of a bit of a flirt, really, used to say that his wife was very understanding because what happened on the set stayed on the set. He was also permanently stoned the whole time. There was a sequence in the film where Bruce Barry had to be pulled around a swimming pool. And that took a long time to do, I remember. I mean, they made this kind of Heath Robinson contraption, you know. I have a feeling there was someone under the pool with him. I can't remember. But I think there was someone under the pool, and he was on a kind of, like a cycle thing. Like a trick cyclist, so he was sitting on the top and someone was pedalling up and down underneath the pool. I think it looked quite good in the film, though. I remember we had a lot of trouble with that casserole dish to try and get it to burn, to look like it was burning, and he used acid. That took a long time to shoot, that sequence, because, again, Richard was very, very specific about what he wanted visually. I do remember arguments, I do, and actually with the special effects guy, because Richard knew exactly what he wanted, and he wanted a kind of realism. He wanted a standard, I think, that perhaps the crews weren't used to. I do remember there being arguments, and also because just the organisation of it sometimes didn't work quite as smoothly as it should. I do remember Antony Ginnane. Yes. He used to wear Gucci suits, and I even think he wore white loafers, which is a dead giveaway for wanting to look like a Hollywood producer, isn't it? I've met a few of those producers around the 70s. Maybe in the 70s in Hollywood, producers did wear white loafers. Maybe they did. The one thing I did learn on that film was how to make a hospital bed. I learnt how to do hospital corners on the bed. And I learnt how to change a drip too. Very useful. I've never forgotten how to do the hospital corner. I think at the time it was against the odds that the film would do so well in America and England and Italy. I think it was against the odds. But actually, if you look at it now, even now, if you look at it, you know why. Because I think a well-made thing, a well-made film is always going to survive, you know. And it's a good story. That's what it is. I mean, I was quite amazed when I heard that Tarantino in Kill Bill did a homage to Patrick, because apparently he was or is a great Patrick fan. I'm just so thrilled he's a Patrick fan, you know. And it was when Uma Thurman was in a coma and she started to spit. There you go. I have appeared in a lot of rubbish, and Patrick, I felt, was something better than that. I thought it had class. I thought it was well made. I thought the script was good. I think there was some moments which perhaps went a bit too far. I think when Robert Helpman ate the frogs, I think we were into another genre there. But perhaps a horror film needs those kind of moments, and that's probably why it's become a kind of cult film, because of those moments, I think.
Patrick was a contemporary film, unlike a lot of the movies which we'd be making at that time, which were all basically there was a lot of historical stuff being made. But Patrick was interesting basically because it was a terrific thriller. It was a really good write. You read it on the page and you thought, oh yeah, this is a very, very, very good film. It was written by Everett de Roche, who came out of that whole sort of Crawford genre. Plus it had an English girl called Susan Penhaligon who was in it, who was very big in England at the time, I think, called Roses and Barbed Wire. Had been very, very successful that she was in. And Robert Helpman, which obviously gave it a little bit of credibility. But it was very nice to be doing something modern. Yeah, it was very unusual. It was very unusual. But it was very well written. And that's something which I'm not sure people talk about our writers enough in this country, particularly the writers of that genre. Patrick was very commercial picture because it had all those sort of, sort of like wham bang, sort of one of the special effects. And it was the first time we'd had any special effects here. I think Richard Franklin brought over a guy from America called Conrad Rothman to do the special effects here. And he did special effects which had never ever been done by anyone here. And he in turn started off that industry, which he went on. Conrad stayed out here and had people working under him and passed on all his skills and his knowledge, because we had no special effects industry. We had, like, one guy who used to blow himself up at country fairs in a dunny, the dunny of death, and that was basically a black powder license. That was really it. So it wasn't very sophisticated. The scene was that I had been affected by Patrick's psychic powers, that I went to the oven and I took a hot pot out of, stew pot, out of the oven without putting gloves on, because he'd sort of, put a spell on me or whatever. And the hands actually sort of singed and burned and smoked while I was taking it out. Yes, and that was an acid mix, but I was perfectly all right, look. I don't remember being at all concerned about it, but in those days we were much braver. We used to do a lot of our own stunts and our own driving and our own fights and a lot of those sort of things. We do most of our own stunt work. So you just sort of, as much as anything, we just thought, oh yeah, this is pretty interesting. Yeah, but there was no fear involved, because we trusted each other. Being a victim of this psychic person in a coma, who was Patrick, at one point he stopped the lift that I was in, and I got supposedly jammed in this lift for days on end. And you can imagine what happens if you're in a lift for days on end. Is you eventually, you have to have a piss, you have to have a crap at some point. So all that was added to the set. So I think I probably spent the best part of a day and a half sort of wading ankle deep in poo. Yes, looking terrified all the time. I was very frightened and confused in that role. Richard Franklin was a devotee of Hitchcock, and he was literally, he would study Hitchcock's pictures frame by frame by frame by frame. And he very much designed Patrick along those same lines. Yeah, he used to storyboard a lot of it. And I think in the same way that Hitchcock makes his pictures, or made his pictures, Richard has, that sort of ability to almost pre-edit. He always pre-edits before he shoots. which pretty, you know, pretty solid way to make a movie. Robert loved acting. That was one of the things he really loved doing, and he really just wanted to do more and more and more and more films all the time. And he was terrific fun. He was really terrific fun because they were pretty basic in those days. We didn't have dressing rooms or caravans or anything like that. Well, we had one caravan that everyone shared. And he didn't seem in the least fazed about doing it. And he was still extraordinarily sort of vibrant and fit and young in his way, you know. One time he had to pick Robert Thompson up, and he just went down to the bed and just picked him up, you know. And there was an enormous sort of snap in his back. And everyone went, oh, fuck, you know, what's he done, you know? So, and everyone said, you all right, are you all right? He said, yeah, it's fine, that happens. You know, it was this enormous sort of clunk, something, you know, hip or something like that. But he was extraordinarily strong for his age, and great fun, and was pretty much into anything. And I'd say that was probably so up to the time he actually died. Yes. I can remember him walking around the set at one point looking to see if anyone could score him any hash, because I think he had a new young lover or something like that. You know? Robert Thompson had a lot of problems at times keeping his eyes open, because he had to have this sort of fixed stare all the time to be in a coma in the bed. And I think the makeup department eventually devised something which, some eye drops for him that I think either contained a little bit of Novocaine or cocaine or something like that. So Robert was continually walking around with his eyes like that. You know, try and blink, Robert. It was very successful. In fact, I saw it in Thai one night. I saw it in Thailand, in an open-air theatre in Phuket, I think. And that was very strange, seeing myself, you know, speaking, you know, sort of, It was very incongruous. But I don't know why, but there was, you see, the Americans have a habit of dubbing things. They did exactly the same with Mad Max. They dubbed that, you know, and they were going to dub Breaker Morant. So I don't really see why our all-world industries should kowtow to, you know, the American ear. And I think that's not quite as prevalent now as it was. But again, you see, the Australian accent, or not that Patrick was Australian accent, but the Australian accent, for instance, in Breaker Morant and these people, it was not familiar to the overseas ear. But I still don't think you should be, you know, be condescending in that way to other people's, to another person's industry. But the Americans were very powerful and very demanding at that time. I thought it was just a really good thriller. It was a really good thriller. And I think everyone was saying, oh, God, you know, I remember seeing it once, and, you know, at the end, when he opens his eyes again at the end, which was actually an idea that my wife and I had, and we fed it on to Antony I Ginnane, and he used it, sort of leaving it open that he could come back like Patrick too. But people found that very, very, very sort of, you know, predictable, I think, or certainly the professional media did. I saw a preview with a fairly professional audience. They were all going, he's going to open his eyes again. But I'm not sure that the general public were, you know, it's possibly a little more naive.
I wanted to make a film that would have a large international audience, and so there were several ways of approaching that. One was to ape American cinema, which is what they do with a lot of television that gets shot here now. Certainly I did things up on the Gold Coast where everyone talked in pseudo-American accents, as if that was the dominant culture. But I took the view that if everyone spoke, in quotes, Queen's English, and I don't mean the suburb of New York, Robert Helpman, for example, that everyone would understand it. Well, the Americans didn't agree and revoiced the film, which was a kind of cultural imperialism and annoyed me a great deal. But no, it was definitely an attempt to get as wide an audience as possible. Everett had heard a story about a guy who knew his wife was having an affair, and so rather than bail them up together with a gun or whatever, decided he would scare the hell out of her by faking suicide. And so he ran past the couple in bed and jumped out the window, believing he could catch hold of the balcony on the way down, and he missed it and landed on a car and became a quadriplegic, or perhaps a paraplegic, whichever he became. He was still sexually functional, and his wife then fell deeply in love with him and used to go in and relieve him from time to time, and the nurses used to smuggle her into the hospital. That was the basis of the story. The screenplay of Everett's that I read began much as the original story, with a guy jumping off a balcony and landing on a car and cushioning his fall and becoming a quadriplegic. And I said, how do we motivate a film with a central character who's suicidal? And Everett agreed, so we ripped off the backstory of Psycho and had him murder his mother and her boyfriend. And that scene was very, very precisely planned and storyboarded in shorthand, almost like a montage. I don't think that setting the film in a limited setting was a major challenge to the writer. And bear in mind, I wasn't there during the early stages of the writing. A script was presented to me in its finished form, and I was really knocked out by it, and then I fixed it. But certainly from a directorial point of view, it was a challenge. And I had some doll's house furniture in a shoebox, and I sat there staring at it a lot and working out how many different ways you could shoot such a small space. I wanted the film to be tonally like an occult Hitchcock film. He never made one. He came quite close with the pilot for his television show Breakdown, with Joseph Cotton in a coma. Joseph Cotton, who'd been in a car accident and who had been entirely paralysed, and they assumed he was dead, and only when he got to the morgue and a tear ran down his cheek did they realise he wasn't. But obviously Hitchcock got a lot of suspense out of that situation. I don't remember a lot of specific references, but they were undoubtedly there. Certainly I remember Max Gillies saying to me the night after the screening at the AFI Awards, gee, he really reminded me of Joseph Cotton at the beginning of Shadow of a Doubt. And I suddenly realised why I got annoyed with my production designer when he flipped my sketches of the room and tried to put Patrick with his head on the right of frame instead of the left. And I'd been unconsciously remembering Joe Cotton in Shadow of a Doubt. So I was very keen that it feel like a Hitchcock film, and we made it feel like a Hitchcock film all the way down to the selection of the hospital, which looks like the Psycho house, and even our logo, which looks awfully like the Psycho logo. The telekinesis boom, if that's what you could call it, just happened to coincide. I was annoyed when I saw Carrie, because our script had been around for a year before Carrie. It was probably written at the same time as Carrie was being made, but unless Everett was trying to rip off films that he hadn't seen, then no, it was unconscious, our reference to some De Palma films that were similar. Funnily enough, I looked just recently at Amazon, and one of the negative reviews of Patrick talked about the idiotic scene in the swimming pool, which was, of course, a reference to Jaws. But it was a musical reference because I was struck by how close the famous Jaws theme was to Stravinsky's one of the dances in Rite of Spring. And so we contrived to have a set of loudspeakers underwater in this guy's pool, and he was silly enough to be listening to the Rite of Spring in his pool, and he got attacked by a Stravinsky monster. Sir Robert was a real joy to work with, an absolute pro. Yes, he was up for anything. He and I got on very, very well. The only thing with Sir Robert was you had to keep pulling him back because he tended to be a little bit stagey. Well, Sir Robert more than injured his back, he broke his back. The doctors made the comment that a less fit person would never have survived in the way he did. He was back shooting again after Christmas. He had said he would have no trouble picking up Robert Thompson, that he'd lifted so many ballerinas in his day that it would be no problem, and it was. There was this almighty crack and he collapsed. And fortunately for us, it was our last day of shooting prior to Christmas, and he had Christmas to recuperate, and did. When we shot the shock therapy scene, Robert Helpman said, "Oh, I know all about this because I took Vivian Lee for her shock treatment when she was touring with me and Larry, Sir Lawrence, in the various Shakespeare plays they did in Australia in the late 50s. Robert Thompson said, no, it wasn't Robert, it was the guy who was there as our technical expert, said, well, why don't we just give him some shock treatment? And Robert said, yeah, great idea. He was so keen to get to do something. I wouldn't let them do it, of course, but it might have been effective. I actually suggested recently, while I was writing my autobiography, that someone go through the film and select some stills of, rather close-ups of Robert, just to see how different he looks at different times, because in every scene we worked out a kind of scenario, and I had this theory that if Uri Geller could bend spoons on television, then anything could be projected through the eyes. And so I had Robert with a thought scenario, thinking all kinds of things, and I feel like it comes through. Our choice for the lead in Patrick was Jenny Agutter, and in those days there wasn't all the pressure being put on you by distributors and bureaucrats who had lists of acceptable and unacceptable actors. And so when Jenny Agutter turned out not to be available, I remember Antony I Ginnane saying to her, can you suggest anyone? And she said, oh, I have a good friend, Susie Penhaligon, who'd be terrific. And that was how Susie got the part. When Julia Blake showed up at the wrap party of Patrick, I asked people, who's that and how did they get in? Julia arrived for her first audition in character and didn't let up once until the wrap party, and I might not have cast her if she had come as she really was. She was fantastic. At the time of Patrick, Don McAlpine believed in a realist style of lighting. When I look at his more recent work, I think he's kind of moved on from there, particularly Moulin Rouge. But in those days, he would say to me, well, how would you motivate that kind of light? And I said, I don't know, how would you motivate telekinesis? The crew were resistant to my storyboard approach. They and the fact that I wanted to direct from a chair, because I thought, well, I didn't get it right on Escobonel, so I'll do everything by the book now. And the book was written elsewhere, and the crew, I remember saying to Tom Burstle, my assistant, well, why do you think all the foreign directors sit in chairs? He said, I don't know, I guess they're old. I think Patrick didn't really find an audience in Australia because it wasn't heavily promoted, and it was not easy to promote. I've even heard Village Roadshow say to this day that it's hard for them to sell genre films that are not American because the audience wants to make instant comparisons. And so while they distribute a lot of American genre films, they don't distribute a lot of Australian genre films. And so it was hard to differentiate it from other similar films when it wasn't uniquely Australian. Taking Patrick to Cannes was a very exciting experience. that knocking doors down has never happened to me again. And I was sitting out in the lobby towards the end of the screening, and people were running out through the door of the cinema saying, "Where do I sign? How do I get this film?" It was very exciting. I wasn't initially unhappy with the idea that the Americans were going to make the film better, and I think it was probably a little long, but when they started revoicing it, and when they revoiced Sir Robert, I was really quite incensed. And he was more so, and aided and abetted by me. He and his agent sued them and won, but only won to the extent of getting some extra money. We did have a screening at the Science Fiction Academy in the States of my print of the film, and everyone agreed it was massively superior, and you'll still see on Amazon that thank God, the original version as originally performed by the actors is available now in the States. It didn't have so much of a big push in the States in that the distributors were not that good. The film just seemed to have an energy of its own, and it found an audience after that screening at Filmex, which was the Los Angeles Film Festival. It doesn't exist anymore, but at that time it was a midnight screening at Filmex, and the word of mouth started from there, and yes, it did very well. Patrick leaping from the bed was certainly the major reason for its success. As recently as yesterday, someone from Los Angeles said to me, "I was there the night that was screened at Filmex, and I jumped from my seat when he jumped out of that bed." That's the thing people remember. I had gone to a tent show somewhere near Ballarat at a carnival of some sort, and it was supposed to be a gorilla in a cage, and my wife and I went in and sat there for a few minutes and looked at this guy in a very bad gorilla suit sitting in a not much better cage, and as we were getting up to leave, the guy rushed straight through the rubber bars and grabbed my wife, and I, being the poltroon that I am, shot straight out of the tent and left her to her own devices. And it struck me as interesting how something quite poorly executed can be very frightening if it happens very quickly. And that was the basis of the end of Patrick. Imitation is flattery, of course, so I was pleased to have a sequel made, and they did an amazing job of finding a Patrick lookalike. I never thought they would find anyone who looked like Robert Thompson, and they did. Yes, the sequel, the Italian sequel to Patrick, was flattering, but it was very, very gory and pretty offensive.
As I recall, there was a lot of historical films being made at the time. So just the fact that it was contemporary made it fairly unusual for an Australian film. And then, of course, the fact that it was horror. I don't think it was until movies like Carrie came out that investors maybe saw the potential in that kind of movie. Patrick, as I remember, the script had been around for probably 5 years before we could get any interest in it. So we had a friend who worked at St. Vincent's in Sydney, and she was telling me about a patient named Patrick who was a quadriplegic and could only communicate by spitting. And the idea just grew out of that. He had caught his wife in bed with another man or something, and had was pretending to jump off the balcony and slipped and fell, which has nothing to do with the movie. But so the spitting and the title are the only things that survive. Patrick is a young man who kills his mother in the first scene, and and is partially electrocuted, as I recall, but anyway, winds up in a coma and in long-term care in this hospital. And the young nurse, who's actually the protagonist in the movie, begins to suspect that he's conscious. And that he's not only conscious, but through psychokinesis, he's actually controlling people around the hospital. She's unable to convince anyone else, of course. Patrick, while he is in a coma, develops a jealousy concerning her husband and starts to get quite nasty. Telekinesis would have been fairly unknown at the time, as far as I was concerned, yeah. I wouldn't have used it if I'd thought it had been used before. So I used to write fairly quickly. Usually, I'd get onto an idea and maybe, stay up all night and work very intensively on it so that a first draft would come out very quickly. In those days, I didn't really know very much about screenwriting, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was 300 pages. And I went through a long process with Richard of editing the script. We must have spent weeks working on it every day, all day, every day. I was pretty young and naive and wouldn't have really known the difference between a mystery and a suspense thriller. And so Richard kind of brought me up to speed on all of that and used countless examples of ways of creating suspense and so forth, which I wasn't really aware of. So it was a whole film school just working with him in those intensive 2 or 3 weeks. I tend to write toward a budget and toward making it very controllable. A number of my films would take place primarily in one location and with as small a cast as possible. And I think it just comes probably from television training of being budget conscious, and also the fact that you've got to keep the budgets low to have any hope of getting a project off the ground. I remember them wanting it to look like it was from anywhere. I thought that was primarily Antony I Ginnane's influence. But I found that no matter how I wrote the script, a producer might come along later and want to make it mid-Pacific, want the cars to drive on the other side of the road, that sort of thing. So I suppose I learned to kind of build that into the script, to be prepared for the actor's accent to change to American and to create some excuse why an American was in the country and all of that. I remember one critic at the time saying he'd rather see a bad Australian movie than a movie like that, an Australian movie that I guess pretends to be American. Yeah, Richard had a copy of the revoiced version of Patrick, and as I recall, he wouldn't let me see it. He was really upset about it, and for one thing, most of the actors had British accents anyway. But again, that was just part and parcel of making films in those days. That you never had much control of what happens to it after it's released. I think in the finale, when there's an old gentleman who's walking along slowly with his walker, his job is to turn the lights on each evening, and a drip stand that's fallen over in Patrick's room that's touching the light on the outside and setting up that little electrical circuit, which is of course paid off with Patrick leaping up out of bed. That turned out pretty much the way I'd envisaged it. And there was a trend back in those days to, I guess it started with Carrie. That's the first time I've seen it, when the movie is virtually finished and the hand comes up out of the grave. And I suppose it was an attempt to get interest in a sequel. But no, I always felt that they did it in road games too, with the final scene with the head dropping into the bucket. which is kind of attached on later. And it just seemed to me that you spend the whole movie trying to vanquish the villain, and then in the final few frames you say, oh no, it's a cheat, he'll be back for another film.
If Richard Franklin said that he and I had no cultural integrity at the time we went into Patrick, I think Richard was making a point. I think in truth that Richard has more cultural integrity than many people that I know, but I think that your cultural integrity is defined via your interest in cinema, not in, you know, the number of kangaroos, koalas, or billy hunters that you can squeeze into every scene in your picture. And as for myself, I like to think that I have some too. I think Richard's point about no cultural integrity was that we were prepared to go against prevailing wisdom. We were prepared to crash through or crash. We weren't prepared to be told what we should do. We believed in popular culture. We believed that Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola and Mad Max and Patrick were as relevant and as Australian as Picnic at Hanging Rock. It was comparatively rare at the time of Patrick to see contemporary Australian material on screen at the time. The films that have been remembered from that period, and I guess more relevant looking back, were the historical titles. Did we have trouble getting? Well, it was hard to find writers who were interested in working in those genres. Richard introduced me to Everett de Roche, who wrote Patrick, and they'd known each other from Crawford's. And you know, the interesting thing about Everett, of course, is that he was originally from the States, and so he didn't carry the sort of the baggage of cultural integrity that some of the other Australian writers of the period who were being spotlighted had. You know, he was sort of a surfer who liked movies. I have three all-time favourite directors. One is Hitchcock, one is Hawks, and one is Ford. And so naturally enough, when I got to know Richard Franklin, we found that we had a lot in common. Part of the charm of the Patrick material were the absolute plethora of Hitchcock references. Now, to be fair, we weren't the first film to embrace in such an aggressive way that massive amount of arcane and not so arcane Hitchcock material. De Palma had obviously done it. I mean, he'd certainly done it with Sisters. He'd certainly done it with Obsession. Everett had certainly worked with Richard and had sort of put in the sketch notes for a lot of that material. But much of it, the overlay, was definitely Richard. I mean, you only have to look at the difference between, say, Long Weekend and Patrick, which are, you know, two scripts that Everett wrote broadly around the same time. And there's apart from the, I guess, Nature Strikes Back component of Long Weekend, which I guess speaks us to, the birds and perhaps a couple of other Hitchcockian moments. Long Weekend's a very different sort of script. Richard and I thought we were the smartest kids in the room in a way on that movie, because I guess we were the Hitchcock buffs. And even Don McAlpine, who was DP on that picture, was certainly being introduced to the style and the lighting demands that Richard was throwing at him. There was a strong dialogue in the set between Richard and Don McAlpine with regard to the look of the film. Richard had not only storyboarded the film very, very minutely, but his storyboards had actually, had very detailed references to the sort of visual look that he wanted in each scene. And Don, ex-Film Australia, ex-Commonwealth Film Unit, documentary DP at the time, had a slightly different view of what the film was going to look like with regard to the sort of expressionistic sort of, I guess, combination of Hitchcock and Fritz Lang, I suppose, in a way, that look. You see that very, very extensively in the Roget Clinic, and particularly the lighting of the staircase and some of the interiors and exteriors of Roget's office, going down the stairs, etc. Now, there was a bit of a battle there as to the amount of light and the way that was to be handled, but Richard got what he wanted, and to give Donnie's due, once he got on wavelength with Richard, it worked fine. And it was a short shoot again. I can't remember exactly, but I doubt if we either had 3 or 4 weeks on that shoot. It was very, 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 very tight, 6-day weeks, a lot of moves, and thank God we had that house at least. When we did Patrick, which was 78, I guess, early 78, there perhaps had been 30 or 40 at most Australian films that had been made since the quote-unquote Renaissance started. Everybody was really still learning. Again, what we forget is that today the kids who are coming up working on movies have worked, 10, 15, 20 years. Many of the people that we had on Patrick had never worked on a feature film before. Some of them had worked on television, not all of them. Some of them had perhaps never been on a film set before. So people were learning as they went, and there was no book on how things were done. We wrote that book. We were all learning as we went at that particular point of time, and certainly with regard to effects. So everything that was done was either physical sort of props and prosthetics on the set, or was photochemical in post production on the optical printer or what have you. So your capacity to do certain things required quite a lot of invention. There was not a great history of that. Now on Patrick we brought out a guy, Conrad Rothman, who was an American who'd done quite a lot of sort of pyrotechnical and related work up here, and he certainly assisted. And I think a number of the people who are in effects work thereafter, learned quite a bit from being exposed to Conrad on Patrick. Ways had to be figured out to create effects without damaging people, whether it was fire effects or smoke effects or what have you. I think there was always a concern that we rang in to check our insurance guys every morning when we were doing something on set or on stage. It was. But that's where Australian ingenuity actually in those days worked very, very well. I mean, there were things that, Australians are particularly good at. And I think Australians were always are good at sort of figuring out how to, do something that others might, need, a troop of Marines and, $1 million to do. And we had our hands full trying to cast Patrick, because on the one hand, you're asking an actor to almost do nothing. And on the other hand, you're asking somebody to have the sort of the physical capacity to do nothing. You needed somebody who had particularly, eyes that were particularly powerful and menacing. You needed somebody who had the capacity to, hold that view, and that we used all sorts of, light anaesthetics and various to achieve that effect. But nonetheless. Robert had never really acted before. We used him again in Thirst, and then he sort of vanished off the face of the earth. Sort of a bit like, I guess a bit like George Reeves in Superman in a way. I guess he sort of was cursed forever with the stare of Patrick. Robert Helpman was an absolute gem. And a great Australian, figure in theatre, cinema. Whether you see him in Michael Powell's Red Shoes, whether you saw him in Don Quixote, whether you see him in Patrick. I mean, he played that part, and he played it to the absolute nth of his ability. There were a couple of accidents on the set where he, hurt his thigh, hurt his arm. He just, and he was not a young man when he did when he did Patrick, but he loved that part, and he managed to. Look, there was an aspect of Vincent Price about Robert, but I put it to you that he was marginally less. Not that I'd say Price was hammy in the Corman Poe pictures, although in moments he was, but Helpman played that part with a real sinisterness that I think made it work brilliantly. If I was trying to find somebody to whom you would apply that overused term trooper that I've worked with, I'd have to put Bobby Helpman at the top of the list. Susan had been in a show called Bouquet of Barbed Wire, which had been successful on the BBC, and I think it played on ABC television in Australia. She had also starred in a movie called Leopard in the Snow, which Filmways had bought for Australia. So we had some connection to her agent, Jeremy Conway, I believe it was, in London. And we also felt that there was a good shot of selling or even pre-selling Patrick to the BBC. So Susan's casting, as indeed we ultimately did, Susan's casting helped in that. She was a fine theatre-trained actress and glacial enough to be, to give it the full Hitchcockian 6-9 yards. My favourite sequence in the film would probably be that moment where the statue moves on the desk. Just the sort of the slight suggestion of troubles afoot. Patrick was revoiced and recut for the United States release by Vanguard. I was less troubled by that than Richard was. The US distributors were paying a significant amount of money by then standards to acquire the rights to the film, and wanted to take the film into a release pattern that was very different to the release pattern that any Australian films up until that point of time had. That is to say, they didn't want to release it in one art house screen in 6 or 8 or 10 of the major cities in the United States. They wanted to release it wide. They wanted to release it in drive-ins. They wanted to release it the way in which independent AIP, Crown, New World type pictures were being released. In that context, they convinced me, and I believe the decision was correct, that in a lot of parts of America, the reaction to the film would be restricted and inhibited by an inability to understand the then Australian accents in the picture. Now, you may well say that Bobby Helpman didn't have much of an Australian accent, and obviously Susan Penhaligon had a British accent. But the same rule of applicability would apply to British accents. It wasn't a particularly, anti-Australian thing. It was just a comprehensibility thing. I was heartened two and a half years later when AIP did the same thing to Mad Max 1 and revoiced everybody in that movie, including, ironically, Mel Gibson. Patrick, of all my films, is the one that has the most versions in existence. There's a German version, an Italian version, a Canadian version, an American version, the Australian version, and there are probably a couple of other versions as well. So I didn't have any particular concern about that. Richard was involved in the US cut and initially resisted the dubbing, but basically came round to the point of view that, as I did, that if it made for the film to get a wider release, then all things being equal, he agreed to it reluctantly, I suppose you would say. When it went out in 1979, it would have been the most successful Australian film to be released in the United States at that point of time, box office-wise. It made the Variety Top 50 list, I think, for 5 or 6 weeks on and off, perhaps longer, because it was being released on a state-by-state basis. It would come onto the list and then drop off for a couple of weeks and then come back on again. It sold to HBO, to the other cable channels. We did a huge deal with World Vision. Now that's something that we would not have done if we hadn't had the dub, because whatever one might have been able to argue about theatrical audiences in the bigger cities being acceptive of the Australian accents, we would have never got it on syndication television in the United States. We got $250,000 from World Vision for the picture. That's more than the cost of the film. It definitely did not work as well in Australia as it did in almost every other country in the world. At that point of time, Australian audiences had been sort of hoodwinked into thinking that the Australian films to go to were the art house Merchant Ivory sort of pictures. Secondly, at that point of time, Australian audiences, and it's still significantly true today with some exceptions, don't seem to like genre movies as much as, in cinemas anyway, as much as audiences in other territories. And certainly all the way through the second half of the 70s and the 80s, there were examples of Australian genre films that simply didn't click. It was a huge success in Italy. It was seen by Aurelio De Laurentiis, who is Dino's cousin and now a very successful Italian distributor and producer. And he was setting up a company called Eurocoop, which was an Italian distribution company, and they saw the film and saw an opportunity to Italianize the movie to maximise what they saw as an appetite for horror thriller at the time. And the way they did that was to take Goblin, the group that was both a small rock phenomenon in Italy, progressive rock, and also had worked with Argento and a number of others on scores for their titles. So Brian May's score was taken off in Italy, and a Goblin score was put on, and that added a tremendous amount to the ability to get media coverage and what have you in Italy. The Italians, when they go for a genre, they invented fad, whether it's spaghetti westerns or whether it's police procedurals or what have you. And at this particular moment of time in Italy, there was a real demand for these sort of telekinetic, set in a hospital, something going on. It was just a real confluence of appetite for that picture. Coupled with the fact that it was their first release, they really threw themselves behind it, and it became a monster of a success. It was the biggest grossing picture in Italy for a number of weeks. It was so successful that a rogue Italian producer ripped us off and made an unauthorised sequel called Patrick Viva Ancora, which was a dreadful piece of work, and its only claim to fame was that it managed to find an actor who looked remarkably like Robert Thompson. We didn't know it was being made, and we suddenly discovered, I think the following year at Cannes or the following year at Milan, that a thing called Patrick Viva Ancora was slotted for a screening. And we didn't find it flattering at the time. We found it an unpleasant attempt to rip us off, because at that point of time we were possibly contemplating a Patrick sequel. We never went ahead with it, and I'm not saying that film in and of itself prevented us from doing that, but it certainly annoyed us, and we got Italian lawyers onto it. We weren't able to stop its Italian theatrical release, but we were able to stop it being released anywhere else in the world until very, very recently. I remember when I first got a video, a DVD of it, and sent it to Richard, he nearly fell out of his chair when he saw it. He was actually more knocked around about the XXX content of it than I was. You know, often sequels either wind up like Aliens, you know, and they continue to improve, or they sort of tend to sort of spiral out of control. And I suppose, unauthorised or not, Patrick Viva Ancora is an example of a sequel sort of spiralling out of control. The one other thing I would say about Patrick is that it doesn't seem to have dated. There is still something very, very scary about somebody unable to move, but with that capacity to do things good and bad. And I've watched it over the years, and quite recently with young people who've never seen it, and they get it. They're moved by it, and I think they have similar primal experience to it than those people who saw it on 42nd Street, 30 years ago, which is interesting, because as horror films go, by today's standards, Patrick's very restrained. It's classical. It's not splatter. It's the style, the composition, and the cutting style is very classical. And some would almost say there were parts of it that were slow, measured, but that notwithstanding, it still seems to move inexorably towards that sort of freight train finish. And love it.